If you're thinking about getting a Cinewhoop, you gotta be asking yourself this question. Should you buy one of many really excellent bind and flies that are out there, or should you build your own? This is the NewBeeDrone CineMah, and today I'm going to go through the process of building it. And you can tell from the length of this video that it's a fairly involved process. Yeah, this is not so much a build tutorial, although I am going to take you through the whole process of building this quadcopter. But if it was a build tutorial, I would have done a better job of giving you the right steps in the right order to avoid making many of the mistakes that I made when putting it together. But instead, I've decided to edit this so you can come along for the ride and see what kind of problems a quote-unquote expert like me runs into when we sit down to build a micro quadcopter like this. Now, the bad news for this frame is that it's one of the most complicated frames I think I've ever built. Here's all the carbon fiber pieces, and here is all of the hardware. We have screws of different lengths. We have all kinds of stuff, and I was a little bit intimidated when I first saw that. But the good news is that NewBeeDrone has given us this wonderful instruction sheet, and apparently it's only going to take 3 steps, so I'm sure we'll be done in no time. Let's begin. So here's how this is going to go together. First, let's flip the main plate over, and first these 2 pieces are going to go like so. There are going to be screws to hold it all together at the end. Then these 2 pieces are going to go like so, and then these 2 pieces are going to go like so. And that is how it's all going to fit together. Getting that order correct is obviously going to be very important. So we're going to start with these M2 lock nuts, and we're going to use a ton of these. So get them handy, have them handy. So we're going to take those M2 locking nuts and insert them into the frame plates like so. You got to get them lined up correctly. That's how they're going to go in. They're going to interface with an M2 screw like so, and that's how the frame is going to hold itself together. But this is going to be really fiddly because, as you can see, the nuts will just fall out until there's tension on them. So let's take the frame, and we'll take this piece, and it does not appear to have a front or a back either, so it doesn't matter which way around you put it. Let's just put that piece in place. Make sure the battery pad is on the other side. We're just going to put that in place, and then I'm going to get a cushioned screw, M2 by 8 millimeter. I don't know what a cushioned screw is. And I'm going to go ahead and insert that, and then I'm going to try to, need tweezers. Hey there folks, Joshua from the future here with a little build tip. If you have a set of very fine tweezers like this, it's going to do a lot better than the tweezers that I was using, because you can kind of put the screw on the tweezer like this, and then you can kind of just gently set it into the little cutout and gently leave it there, whereas these guys are just constantly sort of fiddling it around. Anyway, good luck. There we go. If I pinch it from both sides, oh yeah, that's clearly the way to do it. Ha ha. I've done this before, I promise. And I'm just going to leave that vaguely loose, because now once it's got a little bit of tension on it, it shouldn't go anywhere. But there's no need to like make it super rock hard snug right this minute. Okay, so then when you're done, you will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws in, and you will have these 2 front to back plates installed. Next, we will take the side to side plates, and we will do the same thing with them. And make sure that you get these all lined up. They all snap together and fit together. I'll see you in like 15 minutes. So now we've installed the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 8 millimeter screws, and all 6 of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the lower plates are installed. The next thing to do is to get these M2 standoffs and install them. And one of the standoffs is going to go right here. We're going to use these same 8mm screws. In the instructions, technically it says that these are the M2 by 8mm non-cushioned screws. I still haven't figured out what a cushioned screw is. So, and I'm very pleased that they've got a cutout here to pass your driver through. Nothing bugs me more than when frame manufacturers put screws in places where then you don't have the ability to get a screwdriver head or a screwdriver at it because some other part of the frame is blocking it. And now for the rear standoff, we're going to install this antenna holder for the Caddx Vista antenna. I have to say that this does not look like the antenna holder that is in the drawing, but once again, I'm just going to maybe the 3D print has changed or something. We're going to go with what we've got. And first, we're just going to press this standoff through, and then that is going to go in the rear. And there are several screw holes here. I'm not sure how you're going to pick which one you're going to use. And the instructions, they're using the very topmost one, so I guess that's what I'm going to do too. I see where the other two standoffs go. These instructions leave a little bit to be desired. I think they go here and here. Look at the actual frame. Yeah, you see how we got these holes here and here? That's obviously where the remaining standoffs go. Remember when I said I hate it when they put screws where you can't get a driver at them? Yeah. You got to come at it at an angle. Not the end of the world. It's a pretty shallow angle, but still. Alrighty, now all 4 of the standoffs are installed and the antenna holder is installed. We're getting awfully close to having a finished frame here. Okay, don't freak out. I have to show you something. It's tomorrow. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to put the motor mounts on. Oh, and by the way, Joshua from the future here, make sure you put your motors on with the wires facing to the inside. Otherwise, you'll have to take the motors off and redo them, and that's super annoying. Oh, how annoying could it be to take one motor off and put it back on again? You'll see. And we're going to use these motor mounts and these 3D printed, I guess you could call them feet. And we're going to use these M2 by 5mm cushioned screws. The motor mount is going to go on like so, and it does not appear to have a top or a bottom, so don't worry about that. It's just going to slide right down on there. And then we're going to take the foot, and I think putting the screws on it now is going to be the easiest way to do this. Oh my goodness gracious. It is a tight 3D print. Fortunately, it is TPU, and the screws will push through with a little effort. And this little foot is going to slide down, and it's going to slide over the carbon pieces. And you may be thinking, well, what are those screws going to screw into? And the answer is the motor. These 3D printed pieces seem to push these screw heads out slightly, so the screws are kind of coming at an angle through the carbon. And the other thing that I've noticed is that the screw doesn't really thread onto the carbon, so you can sort of turn the screw and it won't necessarily screw in any, right? And I was trying to screw it into the motor, and I was just kind of holding the motor in place and turning and turning and turning, and it was just like biting on the last half a thread, and I was a little worried I was going to damage the screw or strip the motor. So what I think the best way to do this is to push the screw to get as much thread as you can up through, and then try and line the motor up and get it to bite and sort of get started. Once you get the first one done, it's easy to do the remainder. See, it's going in crooked. I can feel it cross-threading. It's not good. It's not cross-threading. It's just squishing down on the TPU. Okay, I was a little anxious. It's just squishing the TPU. So another thing you're going to want to keep an eye on is how tight do you make these screws so that they are fully inserted in the motor, and the motor's not going to come flying off, but they're not protruding past the bottom of the motor and digging into the windings or the wires. So if you look at the motor, you should be able to see past the top of at least one of the screw locations, and you can kind of see down in there to see when the screw is starting to come up to the top and be fully. This is the motor with the cross-threaded screw. I got the screw out, but just take a look where I was trying to drive that other screw in, and it was not going in correctly, and it's just gouged up the aluminum base of the motor, right? I mean, this is aluminum. It would be, these are steel screws. It would be so easy to just completely destroy a motor by stripping out the threads because the screws are not going in the right way. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure what the fix would be. This is the first like actual, like what I would call a defect in this frame. There have been like the huge number of screws required to put it together. I mean, that's just, I'm whining because I'm lazy. But this, I would say, it really needs to be addressed. I had to order another part that was missing from the build, so it's going to be another shirt again. Sorry. Next, we come to the flight controller and the ESC, and we're going to set the flight controller aside for a minute because we need to solder the battery lead onto the ESC. I'm going to get some of this blue tack, which is what is called blue tack. It's really nice for soldering in situations like this, and get my soldering iron heated up. Now this ESC comes with a pre-soldered pigtail, and I noticed that the pigtail has an XT60 connector on it, which has got me wondering because Cinewhoops are in this weird middle ground where sometimes they run with like a 1300 milliamp hour battery that has an XT60 plug, and sometimes they run with like an 850 milliamp hour battery that would come with an XT30 plug. Obviously, the size of the plug determines how many amps it can carry. An XT30 is nominally rated for 30 amps, an XT60 is nominally rated for 60 amps, although for short periods of time they can carry much greater than that. And a good rule of thumb is that whichever connector your battery comes with is what you want to match on the quad, because the manufacturer of the battery puts a connector on the battery that is sized appropriately for however many amps the battery is expected to deliver. But we're in a weird position here. Are we going to be running this with bigger like batteries with XT60s or smaller batteries with XT30s? I guess I'm going to go with the XT60, and because that's what they shipped it with, and I don't feel like soldering up an XT30 lead. And it does give me the option to use bigger, more powerful batteries, but it does mean I'm not going to be able to. I think I have some 850 milliamp hours with XT60s on them, but much smaller than that. I mean, I'm going to be limited to how lightweight the build can possibly get. Now, whenever I've got a pre-soldered pigtail, I always go ahead and add a little bit of my own solder to it, because the solder that they use at the factory is usually lead-free. Don't breathe the fumes, Jesus Christ. Because the solder that they use at the factory is usually lead-free, and that doesn't flow well. So I have leaded solder. I'm going to add a little fresh solder. Good joint, good joint. That's a good joint. It occurs to me also that we do not have a capacitor. This build does not seem to come with a capacitor, but I'm going to add one because that's always a good idea. So here I've added these two wires on top of the main joint, and that's a terrible joint. It's not going to be carrying very much current, and it'll be okay. And then we'll solder the capacitor to these wires. And when we go to mount the flight controller and the ESC in the frame, there's a little quirk that we have to be aware of. You can see here that these mounting holes, they're 30 millimeter sized or 20 millimeter sized, but they are M2 in diameter. But in this case, we have a 20 millimeter flight controller with M3 hardware, and that means that this location here in the front is going to be the only place we can mount it without modification. I'm already seeing some downsides to my I will assemble the entire frame and then put the electronics in approach. Don't get a lot of clearance here on these screws. Let's see what we can do. Let's start by just putting a nut just on the very end of the screw, just to sort of hold it in place. And then we're going to have the ESC. Let's have the battery lead come out the back. So we're going to just fish this through here. And then I will just screw these screws through a little bit more of the way. And then looking at the flight controller, it comes with these gummies pre-installed, but I think that's going to make it too close and touch the ESC. It also comes with these slightly longer gummies with a little bit more clearance, which would be the right thing to use. But rather than pull all the gummies out and put them back in again, which will be a pain in the ass, I'm going to just take one of these little nuts and put this nut on between the ESC and the flight controller as a spacer. That'll also help hold the ESC in place. And here's the result. We've got the ESC with the screws through and a nylon washer or a nylon nut on either side of it. And that means it's the perfect time to solder up the motors. I'm going to give these wires a twist to try to help keep them neat. And I guess I'm just going to bring them right around here and solder them up. Yeah. Is there any reason to bring them in and around from the other side? No. That's some fiddly soldering, especially trying to keep my head out of the camera. Okay, the motors are soldered up. Let me just give you a quick look at what I've done. I got a zip tie here on the arm. Once this is all buttoned up, I'm going to do a little bit more work to make sure these wires don't end up in the props. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do, but until the ESC and the flight controller are sort of pinned down, I won't really know how I want to do that. I also found this capacitor that came, I thought the ESC came with a capacitor. It fell on the floor, so scratch what I said earlier about it not coming with a capacitor. It does, and we will be installing that later. For now though, let's go ahead and get the flight controller wired up. And sheesh, my least favorite thing about 20mm builds is how freaking fiddly the soldering is. I may just fly this with the DJI controller to avoid having to solder a receiver in. Sheesh. Like, yeah, that's, yeah. Especially because it's taken me like 3 freaking days to get this done. 3 days over the course of like 2 weeks. I'm just ready to get this thing in the air and fly it. And here on the flight controller, don't get this wrong, there's one plug for the ESC and one plug for the DJI unit. The plug for the ESC is the one next to the front-facing arrow. And if you get that wrong, some smoke could come out. We're going to insert these screws some more of the way while holding the whole stack down together so the nuts don't turn. And then we will get the last nut on top and see if we can tighten that down. And you want the whole thing snug enough that nothing's going to come loose, but not so snug that it crushes the gummies, because crushing those gummies will negate some of their vibration dampening effect. So just snug enough that there's some friction on the nut to keep it from coming loose. Next I'm going to mount the Caddx Vista, and fortunately it does seem like this cable, I think this is the 12cm cable, I think that's what it's coming with these days. It does seem long enough, so that's encouraging. And that is going to go, can it go, okay, there's no way to do this without taking these standoffs out first. I really screwed myself by putting the whole frame together. The truth is, I just wanted to get B-roll of the frame by itself. I didn't want to disassemble the frame again once I had it all together, because there's so many dang screws and so forth. So I got to take this wire off and fish this wire through. I'm going to do that by removing this 1.5mm screw, and then this little retention tab comes off, and then this pops off, and then I can fish this through. Next we come to this wire, which comes with a flight controller, and this plug here tells us that it is for the DJI Air unit. If we were using an Air unit, this would just plug right into it, but we're not. We're using a Vista, and so we're going to just go ahead and cut that connector off. Now I'm a little bit confused about this plug because there are 2 extra wires here coming off that are not part of the standard DJI wire harness, and I had to look it up in the manual the flight controller, and we can see that they are an extra 5-volt and ground output. And I suppose if you weren't using DJI, you might use those to power your video transmitter or something, but we are not going to need these 2 extra wires as far as I can tell. Now, I know from experience that it is going to be nearly impossible to solder this up while it is mounted inside the frame. So before I go ahead and mount it, and frankly, I should have done this before I hooked up the camera, but I'm just doing everything about this build in the wrong order. I'm going to go ahead and solder this up. The pads on the Vista correspond to the wires in the plug, pretty much left to right. So I'm just going to go ahead and solder them up, and I'll show you the correct way for them to be after I've done it. So here's the final wiring order on the Vista. Make sure that yours is the same side up as mine. Notice that this is the bottom of the Vista without the antenna connector, and then from left to right here is the wire order. And you can also, of course, can compare it to the label on the pads. It should start with VBAT and end with S-Bus. The other thing you'll see is that there's these 2 extra wires here, which we are not going to need. So I may as well just go ahead and cut them off. If you were to need some 5-volt source for something, those wires would be an extra 5-volt and ground output from the flight controller. Now, it's going to be a good idea to install this antenna on the Caddx Vista as well while we have it out of the frame. And we're going to do that by taking our 1.5mm driver, and we're going to remove this screw right here. I think that theoretically it can be done without removing the screw, but it's a pain in the butt, and this is way, God forbid I do something the easy way on this build. We can just slide this little retention piece out. Once we've taken that screw out, then we're going to pop this UFL connector on. There we go. Once it's on, and then what I'm going to do, there is a little tab right here. Right there, there's a little tab, a little pin, and it's going to fit in this hole right here. There we go. And then this is going to slide back in underneath this gray heatsink, and this is going to push back in, and then that screw will go in. That screw is hard to get back in. This little retention piece is hard to get back the way it was, unless you just remove that extra screw. All right, now that that's done, I will go ahead and mount this into the frame with these M2 screws and these M2 nylock nuts. Next, I'm going to take the Vista plug and I'll plug it into the flight controller right here. There's a plug right there. And then we're going to take the Vista antenna, and it should slide just right into the side of this 3D printed mount. And then there's a spot right here where we could put a zip tie to give it some tension. But I can't help but notice this is pretty loose in here. I don't think this is actually a different design of antenna than the Vistas usually come with. I'm not sure if they're shipping them with us now or what, or if this is an exception, but it's smaller and it's looser, and I think we're going to need to do something to kind of keep it from sliding around. I'm just going to grab a piece of this mounting tape here. I'm going to see if I just fold this open and kind of put that down inside there, if that will sort of pad it out enough that it holds. It'll certainly add some stickiness, that's for sure. Yeah, that's going to hold just fine. And then we will take a zip tie, and we'll just snug that around in this little channel here in the 3D printed holder to keep it cinched down. The next thing to do is install the camera, and this original DJI camera has 2 mounting screws, and so it's going to go in these 2 little circular cutouts with 2 screws per side. If you have a camera with a single screw, then you'd use the central one. And then the other thing to keep in mind is the DJI camera that we've got here is just a little bit wider than a standard 19mm camera, and this frame seems to be fitting it perfectly. So that means that if you were putting a standard 19mm micro-size camera in here, like if you're doing an analog build, then you would have a little bit of slop, and that, I believe, is why these washers are included. You would use those washers to pad out that camera. But for the original DJI camera. It fits perfectly, and we just need some screws. I really thought the DJI camera came with screws in it. DJI, have you been cutting corners? Because, like, the economy? By now, you're probably starting to see what I meant back at the beginning of this video when I said the kind of problems that a quote-unquote expert like me runs into when he sets out to build a quadcopter like this. I got a ton of experience building. I know how to put a quad together, but most of it is on 5 inches and above. When you get down to micros like, it's not really a micro, but when you get down to smaller quads like this, everything just gets so much more fiddly, and it kind of bugs the crap out of me. It's probably character building. If you're enjoying this video and following along with my pain, or maybe I've saved you a little bit of pain if you're setting out to build this quad, why don't you go down and hit the like button for me? It'd mean a lot, thanks. Kind of make all of this worthwhile. At this point, the quadcopter is basically together. Like, all the major components are in place, but there are still a few other little steps that I need to do. And one of them is, I want to make sure that these motor wires are going to stay out of the way. They look fine now, but like in theory, they can. I didn't cut them as short as I might have, and they certainly could get into the props, which we don't want. So how am I going to secure that? I think I'm just going to zip tie it to this side plate right here, and we'll just sort of take that slack out. When you're dressing wires like this, make sure that you run the wire flat against the carbon, and don't tighten the zip tie down with the wire going across the edge of the carbon here. This edge of the carbon is sharp, and if the zip tie pulls the wire against that edge with some force, it can easily cut the wire. So we're going to make sure that at the place where the zip tie is tightening it, it is flat against the carbon, and there's no way that that could cut it. Alrighty, now those motor wires cannot really get in the way of the props and get chopped up, or hang outside the frame and get like landed on or something. They are secure. We're going to route the main battery lead out the side here, and I think it's going to go up here in the middle. And once again, that's going to keep it out of the way of the props and make it easily accessible. We'll have to see exactly how we do that. Next, we're going to install this capacitor. And capacitors are extremely important for getting clean video. Everybody knows that about analog systems, but they also give you cleaner video with digital systems like DJI. Basically, you'll just get higher bit rate. Electrical noise affects all electronics. Digital systems just hide it better. It's also going to help protect this ESC from frying. 20mm ESCs are not as durable, and so they need all the help they can get. Most people probably would have mounted that capacitor directly on the ESC. In fact, the ESC even has little holes on its power pads to do that. But I often don't like to do that because you can see how freaking crowded it is in there, and there just often isn't room. So instead, I have some spare motor wire. This is 18 gauge, or is it 20 gauge? 20 gauge motor wire, and I just use that to solder to the capacitor and then mount it wherever I think is best. Putting the capacitor on wires like this does reduce its effectiveness, but 20 gauge wire, just keep the wire as short as you can, and I think this is a more versatile way to do it. We just got to think about where we're going to mount this. So we do want to mount it as close to the flight controller as we can, so those wires are as short as possible. And I think probably like what we might do is just sort of put it sideways against one of these plates maybe, or could we somehow get it vertical in here? I don't know about that. Maybe like, I'm just gonna figure out a way to stuff it in there and then solder it to the wires. Before you start soldering, make sure you note the side of the capacitor with this white stripe and the minus sign on it. That goes to ground. The other side goes to positive, and if you do it backwards, it will pop. It'll make a, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it is can really surprise you. Now that that's soldered up, I'm just going to get a piece of heat shrink and put it on there the long way around to cover the terminals. Yeah, I think that'll stay down in there. Maybe add a zip tie to help keep it from rattling around. You know, as I'm shoving this in here and trying to find a place to stuff it, do make sure that you don't press it up against the flight controller. It's very important that nothing is vibrating. We got gummies in here soft mounting the flight controller. So if we then take this capacitor and just kind of jam it in there and touch the flight controller and make contact between the flight controller and the frame. Now we're just transmitting more vibrations to the flight controller and defeating the purpose. So yeah, definitely make sure that the flight controller is isolated. Before we power up, I'm going to do a basic safety and sanity check. I'm going to take my multimeter, put it into continuity test mode. That's the mode that looks like a little Wi-Fi symbol. It's supposed to be a speaker, but today it looks like a Wi-Fi symbol. And I'm going to touch the probe to the negative prong of the XT60, and then I'm going to touch the probe to something else on the quadcopter electronics that has ground. The most common choice for me is the USB connector. There we go. The outside of the USB plug always is grounded, and we're just confirming that ground on the battery lead is connected to ground on the flight controller. And we can do that same check on the Caddx Vista, making sure it is also wired. And this is a basic sanity check of our wiring. We can do the same thing with positive. That's going to be a little harder to find positive on the flight controller because it has such tiny pads. But I found it over here. It's labeled BAT, and we do have a beep. So on those ones, we want to hear a beep because we are verifying that the wiring is connected how we expect it to. The final check that we can do is to check for continuity between the positive and the negative prongs of the XT60. And we do not want to hear a beep there because we don't want short circuit between ground and positive. You may hear a short beep that stops. See how it stopped all by itself? You may hear a short beep that stops all by itself. That's just your capacitor charging up. That is normal. But if there is a continuous beep between the two prongs, you have a short circuit and don't plug in your battery. You got to find that. I have a whole video about finding a short circuit in your quadcopter. I'll put a link to that in the video description if you want to check it out. Now that that sanity check has passed, it's time to power her up, and I am going to do it with a smoke stopper. This is the V-Fly Short Saver. I've got a review of this as well. If you don't have one of these, you need one. It will potentially save you from frying your ESC, your motor, and etc. And I always use it at least the first time I power up a new build, just in case I've got some mistake made. And some people say, well, you don't have to do that. You just did the check with the multimeter. You know everything's fine. Okay. You may have more confidence than I do, but I'm a belt and suspenders kind of guy. So I'm going to power the quadcopter on in 3, 2, 1. No smoke! Well, no smoke came out. That's good. We did not get the last two motor beeps. The beep, beep. And the reason for that is that hopefully it's that the flight controller hasn't been configured and not that the flight controller is not powered on. No, I see the blinking status LED from the flight controller. It is powered on. That's good. And our Caddx Vista is solid green status LED. That's good. Well, okay. The damn thing is finally built, and the next thing to do is go over to the computer and configure it in Betaflight. And I am going to put that up in a separate video because this one's already long enough. There will be a link down in the video description below when that video comes out. I'll put it out the day after this one, so we won't have to wait very long. But for now, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Is this normal? Is this normal? All you guys who build micros and Cinewhoops all the time, is this normal? Or maybe if I did this more often, I wouldn't be running into these problems. Tell me in the comments. I really want your perspective. Happy flying. Patrons are the people who make all this possible. Not to disrespect you, because you're watching all the way to the end, which really helps the analytics. So I guess without you watching, none of this would be possible. But if you would subscribe or join my Patreon, $2 a month or more, it's up to you. Or at the very least, you know, leave a comment or click the affiliate links and do the show. Isn't it a beautiful day? Man, the lighting looks good out here. What's up, y'all? Out for a walk.